Hi guys, and welcome back to Canada Top to Bottom. Now, one of the most popular ways of moving to Canada temporarily is to get a study permit, but what many people don't realise is that you can actually work in Canada whilst on your study permit, and crucially, for those looking to gain permanent residence, you can apply for a postgraduate work permit, which then allows you to work full-time in Canada once your studies are finished. Once you've built up 12 months of full-time work in Canada on this postgraduate work permit, you can then apply for permanent residence.
This all means that you can come to Canada as a student, complete your studies, work full-time once you graduate, and then become a permanent resident through the Canadian Experience Class Programme in Express Entry. However, and it's a big however, you will only be granted a study permit if Canadian immigration officials genuinely believe that you plan to return to your home country once your study or temporary work visa has expired. As such, you should only apply for a Canadian study permit if you genuinely want to study here and are fully prepared to go home afterwards.
The way to approach this is to come to Canada to study because you genuinely want to and make your plans accordingly. But in the back of your head, you might be thinking that if you like Canada and decide you may want to stay permanently, you've got a potential route to permanent residence.
So, on to the logistics of how to actually go about getting a study permit. As we described in the video linked above, there is no upper age limit on getting a Canadian study permit, but there are obviously some other criteria. Firstly, you need to be enrolled in an official designated learning institution. We've put a link in the description box below so that you can start searching through these. As well as this, you'll also need to show that you have no criminal history and are in good health. You will need a clean police check for any country you've lived in for 6 months or more since the age of 18 and a medical exam to prove these things.
The next requirement, and this is a big one, is that you have sufficient money to pay your tuition fees as well as your living expenses and travel expenses to and from Canada. If you're accompanied to Canada by family members, you'll also need to cover their living and travel expenses. Again, there's a link below with more information about proof of funds, but the basics are that you need to be able to cover the cost of your tuition fees, then should be able to show that you have a minimum of 10,000 Canadian dollars for the first year of your studies and proof of either the same amount again for subsequent years, or have a realistic plan of how you're going to fund your studies after the first year.
In addition to the tuition fees and the $10,000 per year, you'll also need an additional $4,000 per accompanying adult per year and $3,000 per accompanying child per year. As if all that wasn't enough, a good rule of thumb is that you should also have $2,000 per person to cover travel expenses for your journey to Canada and return to your home country. Although this isn't a specific amount which you must have, it's just a recommended sum to avoid any issues.
All added up, let's say you come to Canada to study for 1 year and are bringing your spouse and 2 children. You'll need to pay your tuition fees, then provide proof that you have at least $10,000 for your expenses, $4,000 for your spouse, and $6,000 to cover the 2 children, plus a further $8,000 to cover return travel costs. That's $28,000 which you need to prove you have in addition to the tuition fees, and it only covers you for 1 year. If you plan to stay longer, you'll need more.
This might all sound horribly expensive, and frankly, it is pretty pricey, but there is some good news coming right now. Firstly, you can work part-time whilst studying, and therefore bring in some income and may not need to spend all your hard-earned savings. You need to prove that you have those savings before you come, but that doesn't mean that you're forced to live off them. Part-time work can really make a big difference. In addition, your spouse can also apply for an open work permit at the same time you apply for your study permit. So your spouse could easily be working full-time and you could be working part-time during your time studying. That said, you can't justify having insufficient funds by saying that your spouse will work and cover the costs. The immigration officials need to see that you can afford to study and live in Canada without your spouse's potential income. Plan to have enough money that you could manage without your spouse working in order to avoid any problems.
This is all to say that you do need a good lump sum of money before embarking on a study course in Canada. But if you're smart and hardworking, you may be able to avoid dipping into that lump sum too much once you arrive. Study permits are some of the most commonly rejected applications in the Canadian immigration system. So tick every box, provide clear evidence that you can afford to pay for it all, have the genuine intention to both study and return to your home country when your permit expires, and don't give an official any reason to reject your application.
Assuming all goes well and you make it to Canada on a study permit, the next step is to actually complete your studies. Once that's out of the way, you can then apply for a postgraduate work permit, the length of which will depend on the length of your study permit. If your study permit was for 2 years or less, your postgraduate work permit will be the exact same length as your study permit was. But if you studied for more than 2 years, you can get a 3-year postgraduate work permit. It doesn't matter if you studied for 10 years or 2 years and 1 month. You're entitled to a 3-year postgraduate work permit once you've completed more than 2 years of studying in Canada. And the great news is that this is an open work permit, meaning you can work for whoever you want in any field.
And this is where things start to get really good. Once you have your work permit and are working full-time, you are building up Canadian work experience, which is vital if you want to become a permanent resident in the future. Once you have 12 months of full-time paid employment in Canada, you can then apply for the Canadian Experience Class program of Express Entry, provided you meet certain other criteria.
The main criteria are that you meet the language requirements for your job. There's a link above to our playlist all about language tests for Canadian immigration, and that your job is classified as either a managerial job, a professional job, or is one of the eligible technical jobs and skilled trades. The Canadian government classifies occupations using the Canadian National Occupational Classifications, or NOC system. And again, we've linked to the relevant page in the description box below. Check whether your trade or profession qualifies before going any further. And be aware that these NOC codes are about to undergo big changes, so watch this space for further details.
There are no educational requirements for the Canadian Experience Class, and if you get your permanent residence through this program, you can live anywhere in Canada other than Quebec. Canadian Experience Class is one of the quickest and most surefire ways of moving to Canada. So if you can become eligible for it by gaining 12 months work experience in Canada, then you're in a really strong position.
So in summary, come and study in Canada legally and by obeying all the rules. Once you're done studying, apply for a postgraduate work permit, gain 12 months of work experience, and apply for the Canadian Experience Class stream of Express Entry to gain permanent residence. Done! We actually know 2 couples who gained their permanent residence this way, so it's a proven route to PR. Good luck with it all. Ask any questions you might have in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.